Hi, I'm Ozie Hall, and I'm going to talk to you today about Black History Review as part of the Critical Race Issues series or forum that we have been presenting. Um, there's a passage in a document called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. The Book of Coming Forth was first found in a document called the Papyrus of the Nile from ancient Egypt, um, from somewhere around the 18th dynasty. But an earlier version of this document, going back to about 4100 BC, was found in something called the Papyrus of Nefer. And there's a passage in it that says, "We come from the beginning of the Nile, at the foot of the mount of the moon." And there's a part that says it says where God happy dwells. And when you go back and look at it, it actually is making a reference saying the divine hippopotamus. And so this gave a specific geographic location for researchers to look to discover the origins of man. Up until that date, people had used the Bible, they used other documents. There's actually found over 750 documents or publications or stories or mythologies even about the creation that basically give an explanation about the creation of man. But this one was the oldest known, and it was the most credible in terms of its sources and foundations. And so it led to the uh, the Leakey family. Mary Lewis and Richard Leakey were a British archaeological team who, based on the Book of Coming Forth, actually went to a place called the Aduvial Gorge in Central Africa. And so this archaeological team discovered um, the bones of Zinjanthropus basi on the after excavating in the Aduvial Gorge, where they found the oldest human fossil remains that go back something like 3.5 million years. And this they declared as the oldest fossil remains found on the earth and as the birthplace of man. Africans called this uh, skeleton that they found Membujige, the mother of humanity. The Leakeys called her scientific name was Australopithecus africanus, and they named her Lucy. So the Leakey expedition was later supported by DNA mitochondria evidence that was developed by the eminent cell biologist Dr. Rebecca Kahn. So using the study of cell biology and electron microscopy, using this in Black history research, um, uh, they discovered in the DNA mitochondria, they found evidence to indicate that the Black woman was the mother of humanity and that her genetic characteristics um, demonstrated an African origin. So this became a significant corroboration of the findings of the Leakey family. So Dr. Rebecca Kahn, um, and many called it that she found the mitochondrial Eve. And so this became very significant because what she did was by comparing the mitochondrial DNA variants to each other, they produced a tree, a family tree, and showed that humanity descended from a single maternal ancestor, and not only that, that the localized root of the tree was in Africa. So this was a very, very significant finding. So when we go back and we look at the evidence, you can go back and you see the earliest maps would identify the Atlantic Ocean as the Ethiopic Ocean. And the world was conceived of very differently during that particular time. But in terms of all of the evidence pointed to an African origin. And during this time, when the scientific community was producing this hard evidence about the African origin of human civilization, there was the Piltdown scholars, for example, where they planted a fake skull in Britain, and they announced it to the press, and they said that the origin of man was in England. And so you had a number of different academic scandals where it was later proven that it was a fake skull that was planted. You also had people come out with what they call the Teutonic origins theory, to say that the only people endowed with the wisdom and knowledge to build stable government was the Teutonic tribes of Germany, and that they in fact were the superior race. They came out with all types of fraudulent academic schemes in order to try to discredit and displace the fact that Africans were the original people on the planet, and then spread out and radiated out around the globe. And that these Africans were in fact the progenitors of the human race, and that there were in fact no separate races, that races, the white race, the black race, the yellow race, the red race, the brown race, that all of these racial concepts were mental constructs created later to try to classify people, that basically led to social classes and were used for military and discrimination type of purposes. But in fact, from a biological standpoint, man had a common origin and was one common set of people, of beings on the planet, and that there were only superficial variations in skin color and eye color and hair texture that had to do with climatic conditions that existed on the earth. For example, Africans left Africa and traveled into what is called the Caucasus region, and they were caught in 4 primary ice ages. The last ice age receded around 75,000 years ago, and as a result of that ice age, there was a group of people who, having lived in caves, out of the light of the sun, out of proximity to ultraviolet radiation, their eye texture changed. They didn't need pigment in their eyes because of being out of proximity to the ultraviolet radiation of the sun from like a tropical type of environment. So what they did was their eyes became blue over time. They lost the pigment in their skin, so they became pale skin over time, and lost their melanin because they didn't need it to protect them from the ultraviolet rays as they would in a tropical environment. In addition to that, their hair laid down and got straight and turned blue, lost its pigmentation, because in a cold, frigid environment, the hair would tend to lay down in order to adapt to the cold condition, because the hair lays down to try to keep the body warm. In a tropical environment, the hair will bead up, become kinky or nappy in order to try to catch sweat and to be able to cool the body down. And so there were biological foundations and bases to show the variations in the morphology of humans in terms of their height and their skin color and their eye color and hair texture. So all these things were very clearly identified as superficial mutations, but it all points back to an African origin. And so when you began to really look at history, what you see is that in the modern times, the map of Africa is basically reduced in terms of it's not proportional to what it actually is. And so when you look at a map, they increase the size of the United States, and they increase the size of Asia, and increase the size of South America. They decrease the size of Africa. So when we look at the whole concept of an attempt to diminish Africa, to be able to make it look as less than what it actually is, and part of this has deep historical roots in racism and what has happened to Africans. So what I want to do is I want to take a step here and talk about early African civilization. We can go and look at the various ruins around the world. The oldest significant ruins that we find is in the area known as the Nile Valley civilization, which includes ancient Egypt, in Nubia and those areas that are further to the south that actually existed. So according to Professor Chiekh Anta Diop, the evidence shows that the civilization started in the south and then moved north and then blossomed into a culture that we know as ancient Egypt. But there was a pre-dynastic period of time when there were a series of reigning kings that developed the pyramid building, that developed the use of poured concrete, that developed the mathematics, and developed the calendar system, and developed all the technology that laid the foundation for the development of human civilization. And that while there's hard evidence there supporting that, in Mesopotamia, for example, we hear emphasis on the Sumerians, and we hear emphasis on the people of that region as being the cradle of civilization. But according to Professor Chiekh Anta Diop, you have dirt mounds and mud mounds, and you have some tablets that are cuneiform tablets that show business transactions. But in fact, the hard evidence is lacking, and most of the information is either anecdotal information or come from documents that were written much later in time in terms of hardcore evidence to support this theory of the cradle of civilization being there. The hard evidence shows that the earliest civilization of significance that had the mathematics, that developed the science, that developed the technology, the engineering, that all of this occurred in the Nile Valley civilization. And then in addition to that, there is a substantial record to show that, like, for example, the Sphinx had clearly distinct African, or what they call Africoid features. If we look at, for example, the pharaoh Khufu was considered to be one of the greatest pharaohs. The Great Pyramid is named was developed for him. And there was about 79 pyramids created between 2700 and 2200 BC. And this was the most significant period of time, the pyramid building time. And Professor Diop points out that all the early kings from pre-dynastic time up to the 14th dynasty were exclusively indigenous Black Africans. And so this period of the major cultural development that took place, the technology, the science, all of these things occurred under Black African leaders. So we can go and look at just so much evidence that exists to support the whole ideal that about the African civilization. There's was just a host of ruins and hard evidence to indicate the building prowess and the scientific knowledge and achievement that Africans had achieved there in the Nile Valley civilization. So it's difficult to refute the hard evidence. There's a saying that about the truth that even the rocks would cry out. And Count C.F. Volney, who was a French historian and anthropologist and philosopher, he wrote in 1793 about those ruins in the Nile Valley, those buildings and structures that we just showed. He says, those piles of ruins which you see in that narrow valley watered by the Nile are the remains of opulent cities, the pride of the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. Behold the wrecks of her metropolis, of Thebes with her 100 palaces, the parent of cities, and the monument of the caprice of destiny. There a people now forgotten, discovered while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences. A race of men now rejected from society for their black skin and woolly hair, produced or founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. And so this is a very significant observation by a Frenchman in 1793. If we go back and take a look, what we'll find is that the first writing scripts were developed in ancient Egypt. The first numerical system, the first university system. We see the development of science, mathematics. They had an atomic theory. They had an advanced system of medicine. The writings of philosophy were often, that we find from the Greeks in later periods, are often simply either copied or paraphrased from earlier African philosophical statements from ancient Egypt, such as from the papyrus of Ptahhotep, or the maxims of Kamish, or some of the other earlier writings that predate even the Bible, in the books of Proverbs. And for example, there's entire passages of the Proverbs in the Bible that they have actually found predated the Bible itself. Passages like, for example, it says, "My son, incline your ears to my sayings. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to all those who find them, and health to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." This passage is found in the Bible, but it was also found in ancient African writings prior to 2200 BC. And so this is very significant. We look at some of the contributions such as architecture, column buildings, and headers over, door frames, and all types of structures that was the foundation of modern architecture. The use of poured concrete, development of not only the stellar calendar, but they have a stellar calendar, lunar calendar, and a solar calendar. So they were aware of how the movement of the heavens and where the Earth was situated within our solar system. They identified 5 planets. They developed a significant amount of literature, religious concepts, structures of government, and moral laws. One of the world's first multi-geniuses was a man by the name of Imhotep, whose name means "I come in peace." He's considered the first multi-genius because he designed the first step pyramid in ancient Egypt. So he was distinguished in architecture. He also was reputed to have developed a book on pharmacology that dealt with 750 plants and their medicinal use. In addition to that, he's credited with a multitude of other things, and he was worshipped by the Greeks under his Greek name is Asclepius. and he was worshipped as the god of medicine, in reference to Hippocratic oath. And so, this is very significant. When we go back and we take a look at, for example, Moses is attributed in the Bible with being the first monotheist, or actually Abraham, and then Moses, becomes significant in terms of making it a prominent issue. But what happens is King Akhenaten is reputed to be the first monotheist in history. And we can see the substantial evidence of his monotheism in spite of the arguments to say that all of the Egyptians were polytheists. We can go through and we see King Seti and King Horemheb and King Ramesses the first, second, third, and fourth, and King Dozier, and King Khafra. We see King Menkaure. We see King Menes, who's also sometimes referred to as Aha, or Narmer. Queen Hatshepsut, who built a temple, the Temple of Hatshepsut actually has images of the stars, and they basically carved in the ceiling of the monument the image of the sky and the position of the stars. Queen Tai and Queen Nefertiti and Nefertari, and of course the famous King Tutankhamun. And when we look at this issue in terms of mummification, there's often a mystical sense given to it, as though this was all about magic and the afterlife. But if we look at the work of the late Professor Chiekh Anta Diop, who developed something, a radiocarbon laboratory at the University of Dakar in Senegal, and he used his scientific knowledge. As a physicist, he was a physicist, a mathematician, a linguist. He was distinguished in about 5 different disciplines at the PhD level. And he established at the Cairo Conference, along with Theophilo Bengo from the Congo, in 1974, that the ancient Egyptian language was an indigenous Black African language, and that all the early kings were indigenous Black Africans. And so he proved that the early high culture of ancient Egypt was indigenous Black African high culture. And he developed something called the melanin dosage test, to take skin samples from mummies from around the world that had been stolen from ancient Egypt and were in various private collections and in museums around the world, to test the mummy's skin for melanin to establish that these were indigenous Black Africans. And so now this melanin dosage test is even used, to identify burn victims, and to identify, who their racial identity, and learn different things about them from a scientific standpoint. But it's very significant, this work that Professor Chiekh Anta Diop did. And he also wrote a number of books, including a book called The African Origin of Civilization, where he lays out the evidence in some detail. And so, this, you can look at the interview, and I'll put it in the description below, where you can look at an interview from Professor Diop. But Africans exported the use of poured concrete, and there's a substantial body of evidence now that shows that the pyramids are not made from cut stone, and that most of the building that took place, where we often hear it's now being called the myth of cut stone and the use of slaves to do all this building, when in fact it was not slaves involved in building of the pyramids, and that the Hebrews weren't even in existence when the pyramids were built. At least they weren't supposed to be. They weren't in ancient Egypt. And when we go back and look at the um, the evidence from around the world, whether it's the Olmecs of Central America, whether it's the monuments on Easter Island, the pyramids in Cambodia, the monuments in Australia, monuments in India. All of these show the hallmarks of having been created by the ancient Egyptians, who actually traveled around the world and brought their building technology to different parts of the world, and they mixed in with indigenous cultures of people and basically laid the foundation of civilization for them. So there's a movie that will be in the description. It's called The Great Pyramid K 2019. A very important movie. I think that's going to give you information about um, poured concrete and how the Egyptians spread this around the world, showing you basically hard evidence to support this belief, to show that these pyramids, they weren't built by aliens, they weren't built by some unknown civilization that predated our modern era of time with humans. That the hard evidence actually shows that these were black Africans from ancient Egypt who developed this culture and spread it around the world, and that there just simply has been a denial of who did it, in spite of and in face of the hard evidence that's irrefutable. So, if we began to take a look at um, the development of African civilization and its spread throughout the world, um, the origin of civilization is African, and humanity owes a great debt to the service, the contribution, the intellect, the knowledge, the everything that the Africans have contributed to human civilization. And this all refutes and flies in the face of the racist point of view that has been presented over time to try to diminish Africans and make it look like Africans were savages and that Africans made no contribution to human civilization, because though that's a myth, it's all a lie. And so there is a strong body of evidence to show and prove that it's a lie. And it's a lie that needs to be debunked and dismissed forever. And so thank you for taking the time to bear with our presentation, and look at the links. Also, I encourage you um, to like and to hit like and subscribe to the channel.